Um, sorry, I think that might be one of us. I will mute myself too while you're doing your introduction. But we can get started and then Nora can keep admitting folks as we go.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tracy Laliberty, and I am the Executive Director for the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, and it is my pleasure to be able to welcome everyone to the Zoom presentation today on behalf of our center and the University of Minnesota's College of Education and Human Development and the School of Social Work. Today's event is made possible through funds by the University of Minnesota, the United States Department of Health and Human Services, which is managed by the Minnesota Department of Human Services, Child Safety and Permanency Division. This webinar is one in a series that we've put together to focus on permanency and transition to adulthood for youth in the child welfare system. We typically have an in-person conference each spring. However, due to COVID-19, we were unable to gather in that way this year. We are fortunate that we have technology available to us in this country that brings us together virtually so that we can still learn from one another and gather together. We must start this webinar. We want to start this webinar by acknowledging that our university is on the land, and the land on which we broadcast this webinar in Minnesota is unceded, traditional, ancestral, and contemporary land of the Dakota people, who are the first people of Minnesota Makoche. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and work to hold the university and our partners accountable to American Indian peoples and nations. We also acknowledge slavery's deep roots and recognize the significant role that captive and free African Americans have played in building our country, the United States of today. Finally, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Karina Berry, Denise Cooper, Karen Sheehan, and Nora Lee from our outreach team for their diligent work over a difficult few months to bring both the CW 360 publication and this webinar series to fruition. And now I'd like to introduce Karina Berry, our Director of Outreach at the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, and she will go through logistics and introduce our speakers.
Language, Tracy.
Can anybody hear me? I can't hear anybody.
Hi.
Is there a way that I can hear people?
Hi, Christine. Can you hear me? This is Karina.
I unmuted myself. I'm on video.
Maybe Nora, could you try messaging Christine? Okay, thank you. We'll help get Christine. Well, hello everyone. Thank you again for joining us. I will just kind of quickly go through some logistics to just kind of about the flow for the webinar. If you could keep yourselves unmuted unless our speakers for today ask you to unmute yourselves. If you would also please send any questions or thoughts you're having throughout the presentation in the chat. We'd love to use that as a space to create conversation, and we will refer to the chat. It'll allow our presenters to be able to refer to the chat for your questions. And we'll save the chat at the end too. And it's helpful for us to see how the conversation's flowing, what's on your minds, and kind of what some of the requests or needs of around this work. So yeah, and a couple other logistics. I will email out CEUs, a copy of the video, the archived video of the presentation to everyone that is registered and attending. And our CW 360 publication, which Tracy mentioned briefly, that we do annually and focuses on the same topic as our spring conference, which would normally be in person. We have been working away for months and months, and we are very close to getting it to you all. And I'm hoping by the end of this webinar, we'll have the link for you to be able to access it digitally. And you'll be able to see Peter and some of the Casey team were able to contribute an article in that issue as well. And so I will loop back before the end of the webinar, hopefully with a link and or by email, so you all can access that digitally and share with your networks. And so at this time, I'd like to get us started and introduce Peter Pecora, who's the Managing Director of Research Services for Casey Family Programs. And Peter, you can share more.
Thank you, Karina, and it's a pleasure for us to be here. We do want to thank the center staff for the invitation to present today on the challenges and practice strategies for supporting legal and relational permanency for children in out-of-home care. The team is going to stop twice to entertain and address questions that we hope the audience and comments that the audience will put in the chat feature that Karina mentioned. And that'll really help us make sure we're entertaining some of those questions for you. I do want to begin by introducing the Casey speakers today and a special guest that we have with us. I'm going to start the presentation by providing an overview of the major challenges for achieving permanency. Then Matt Claps is going to introduce the Casey Child and Family Services practice model. Then Whitney Brosted and Amy Zimmerman are going to present how the new Casey research backs up our thinking about what works to help youth achieve permanency. And then Feniel Jones, Holly Parks, and Teresa Nord will address practice strategies even further by commenting on the research questions and the research findings, I should say, with Matt facilitating that discussion. So, and then again, we'll close with time for additional questions for the audience. So we'll stop twice. So let's get to this, and we'll start with the next slide here. For federal fiscal year 2018 and 2019, across the United States, in many but not all states, we saw slight decreases in the number of children in care. So as of the federal fiscal year ending on 9/30/2019, we had 423,997 children in care. In that time period, more children entered than exited out-of-home care. And that's the opposite of what we would want to have happen. In a sense, we want to shrink our foster care system and not grow it. And with the pandemic and some of the, at least in 19 here, we had still some vestiges of an economic recession underway. We had still more children entering than exiting. 46% had been out of home care for less than a year, which is when foster care really serves as that temporary safety net strategy that we all hope it would be. But unfortunately, 27% of the children had been in care for 2 years or more. And even more concerning, over 21,000 children had been in care for 5 or more years. Some of these children are in relative foster care placements, but these children, we would argue, deserve legal and relational and emotional permanency, as well as the enduring family relationships that generally accompany some type of legal permanency. And finally, we wanted to highlight that through no fault of their own, over 122,000 children were waiting for adoptive homes. So we have some areas for improvement and some important successes that we can use to address these kinds of challenges, like family finding, KEEP, rapid permanency reviews, permanency roundtables, permanency-oriented family group conference sessions, and 30 days to a family. We have these and others to build on in the field. And we know members of the audience here, some of you are actually leading these kinds of programs or have been working for many years in these programs, and we really salute and commend your work. Let's move to the next slide. As we all know, permanency planning is a very difficult area of practice, and I apologize for some of the tiny font here. I know we'll make those slides available after the presentation. It might be a little more readable for you, but I'll walk us through those quickly. This slide just tries to highlight some of the major challenges to achieving legal and relational permanency, and I'll highlight a few. Child disempowerment. In our studies of foster care alumni, and we've interviewed over 2,000 foster care alumni in 5 states. That was one of the issues that really angered the foster care alumni the most, was when they were not empowered and really made part of that case planning team, and they felt like case plans were done to them instead of them co-piloting those plans. So the point is, youth need timely information, involvement, and decision-making. Otherwise, that's why we see some of the behavioral outbursts, the running away, and children sort of sabotaging some of their own casework plans. A second major challenge is insufficient family finding. Children and youth may need assistance in identifying, reaching out to, and building a relationship with caring adults who in fact might serve as their forever family. The adults who a child relies on for enduring support should never be paid staff, but family or created family. And that's one of our big challenges. And we have a solution, family finding or its derivatives, that we can be using to try and help address that. I do want to acknowledge that staff overload poses problems in many child welfare agencies today. And that can be a real problem because workers then lack the time necessary to build the relationships with the children to help them identify who might be resources to them as a permanent family. And that time is critical. And sometimes if the supervisors are overloaded, they lack the time to provide the support and oversight about which children are languishing in foster care and how best can the caseworkers that they're teaming up with try to move those children to permanency. Want to highlight another area, and that's foster parent inaction. At times, I think we've all worked with foster parents who really don't see their role as helping to accelerate permanency. They feel uncomfortable in working with birth families, and that really can be a stumbling block towards really making sure that the child and their birth family are supported in that journey. Inadequate birth family supports are some of the things that our social workers at Casey Family Programs and other organizations have mentioned to us are really important because they become true barriers for some of our birth families in getting themselves into safe and stable housing, getting the kind of financial assistance they need to support those children, to keep them clothed and fed.
Where are you?
We know that institutional racism may be an issue.
I'll be right
I
back
think
then.
Tina, Jay, and a few other folks might, thank you.
And Peter, you're now muted.
There we go. We know that institutional racism at times, thank you, Matthew, has posed barriers to some of the birth families in getting the resources they need. Substance abuse treatment typically may be in short supply or we're not providing enough of the whole family substance abuse treatment, where parents and their children are treated in a sheltered apartment or in a special complex together. We have very few of those facilities, even though now Family First, the new Family First law, will pay for those or pay for part of those. And then frankly, another area is transportation, both to get to visits and for some of the other support and employment needs that they have. If you don't have a reliable car or access to reliable public transportation, that really can be a real barrier to getting to the treatment and the employment appointments that you need. We do want to highlight that there are certain child conditions that may be a challenge as well, right? When children have undertreated emotional behavioral conditions, as some of the alumni mentioned to us in our studies, it's a little hard to focus on where you want to be adopted or where you want to live next if you're battling a massive level of depression or you've got such high anxiety that's untreated that it's hard to even get out of bed in the morning. So we really want to acknowledge that we've got to make sure that the youth and the children have the kinds of skilled emotional behavioral treatment that they need. And some of the children have special medical needs, and making sure that their diabetes or some other special medical condition can be addressed, and that next, hopefully, permanent placement is a real important issue. And then finally, a bucket here I've called the child-family issues, and that's where we have a pretty severe child-parent conflict going on, and until that is resolved, reunifying that child in that birth family is going to be difficult. Years and years of stress or some type of grudge or conflict can really make it very difficult for even the most dedicated caseworker to try and achieve permanency. And I do want to acknowledge that in a disproportionate number of families or case situations, we have children who are GLBTQ who have been kicked out of their families and have ended up on the street or in foster care because the families are not accepting of their sexual identity. So we just wanted to highlight just a few of the challenges here. These are very real roadblocks that get in the way, and I want to turn it over to Matt and the team, because they're going to talk a little bit about some of the practice strategies that the KC Family Programs staff have been implementing, and some of the new research findings that back up some of those strategies. Thanks, Matt. I'll turn it right over to you.
Thank you, Peter. And good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Claps, and I am the Senior Director of Practice for Child and Family Services here at KC Family Programs. And it is a pleasure to be able to join all of you, and thank you to the Center for inviting us to spend this time with you together this morning. So as was mentioned earlier, our team is going to share some of our own in-house research findings. And then from there, we'll transition into a facilitated discussion with several of our clinicians and a parent, mentor, partner, constituent advisor who works alongside us to hear some of their thoughts and insights around what was learned in the research and the implications and the opportunities for improving practice and advancing outcomes for youth and families. Before we jump into some of our own in-house research, we thought it might be helpful for me to just take a couple of minutes and tell you a little bit about Child and Family Services. And if I take any more than 5 minutes, I'm going to ask my friends that I'm co-presenting with just to give me the signal and cut me off. So, but to tell you who we are, so KC Family Programs, we were actually founded over 50 years ago here in downtown Seattle by Jim Casey and the Casey family. And we are the benefactors and the charitable legacy of United Parcel Service. So go Brown when you need to ship anything. So we were originally founded as a long-term foster care provider, which 50 years ago was actually kind of an innovative thought, because Mr. Casey recognized the importance of stable connections. And that belief is really embedded in our DNA as a provider organization. And so now we work to provide and improve and ultimately prevent the need for foster care in America. And we do that work in our direct services, really guided by the principles that are inherent in the Indian Child Welfare Act that recognizes the centrality of family, that children have a right to remain in their own homes whenever it's safe and possible to do so. And when not, to be with family and connected with family and connected to community and connected to culture. So we try to live these values in our approach to our work. Just a little bit about who we are as a direct service provider agency, and you may be familiar with KC because we also provide consulting services to county and state public child welfare systems and tribes across the country. But in terms of our direct services, we operate 9 offices in 10 communities, and that's because our Arizona office is both in Tucson and Phoenix. But we also have offices in the states of California, Washington, Idaho, and Texas. And on any given day, we're working with about 800 to 1,000 youth and families that are recipients of our direct services. We're a licensed child placing agency. We have about 180 staff that are working in our direct services. And in terms of our service population, we provide in-home prevention services, so prevention of injury, We also provide young adult transition services for youth who've aged out of care. But the bulk of our service provision is actually in our out-of-home care program. And in our out-of-home care program, our target population are primarily older youth, 11 years or older, and have been in the foster care system for 2 or more years. And so we believe that no youth should age out of care, that children have a right to be raised with family, and family have a right to raise their own. On the screen, this is our practice model, and I know our practice model is a bit of a term of art, and our staff try very hard to work by the values and the approach and the processes that are articulated here. And so just to tell you a little bit about our work before we jump into the research, I'd say that our practice is defined by the urgent and relentless engagement of youth and families, with family finding, child and family teaming, or multidisciplinary teaming as core practice drivers that we use in our day-to-day work. We're users of the CANS and the FAST in terms of our functional assessment for all of our youth and families. And our staff draw from a toolkit of trauma and healing informed and practices and other interventions and practices to advance our values around diversity and equity and inclusion. So we take an individualized approach in our work where we work alongside families trying to empower and advocate and support them as they navigate the child welfare system. So that's just a little bit about our practice, and we thought that might be helpful. And with now, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Amy Zimmerman and Dr. Whitney Rostad, who co-lead our what we call our Data to Practice series, which is our in-house program evaluation or our research endeavors, to share a little bit about what we've been learning in our work. So Whitney, Amy, I'm going to turn it over to y'all.
Thanks, Matt and Peter. I am Amy Zimmerman. I'm the Director of CFS Systems Data and Reporting. And I'm going to talk about the findings from our second Data to Practice report. And so our Data to Practice series is our in-house CQI series, so our Continuous Quality Improvement series that is our learnings from questions from our direct services staff. And so we have a process where we go to our staff and ask what research questions are they interested in having us answer. And then we'll go back, we'll do the analysis, and once we have our findings, we'll come back to our staff with our findings, and then together we generate recommendations. And so it's really bringing our direct service staff involved throughout the research process. So for Data to Practice 2, the question that our staff wanted us to answer was, what is the impact on placement with family on safety, permanency, and well-being? And next slide, thank you. We found, maybe not surprisingly, that the more time you've spent with family, the higher their rate of legal permanency. So this slide, we chunked out our time with family into 4 categories. So we have no time with family, 1 to 50% time with family, 51 to 99, and then 100%. And we can see that in each step up in these categories that we have a greater percent of youth that move to permanency. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is a survival curve analysis, and what you want to have is that we have the line move from the upper left to the bottom as fast as possible. So we want to keep the lines as close to the left of the graph as much as we can, and we see that our green line, that's our youth who spent 100% of time with family, and they move to permanency fastest. And then next up is our 51 to 99% time with family. And then you see a little flip with the final 2 categories. But essentially, what we see here is that the more time you spend with family, the faster they move to permanency. So not only do they have a higher rate of permanency, they move to permanency faster. All right, next slide. Okay, and now Whitney's going to talk about data to practice number 3, which again was brought from questions from the field. So take it away, Whitney.
Thank you, Amy. So our data to practice 3 is really an evolution from data to practice 2. In data to practice 3, our social workers were really interested, our direct practitioners were really interested in, okay, so what about the youth who come in without a family placement? So what are the legal and relational permanency outcomes for youth referred to CASCW who are not placed with family? So this next slide shows really in data to practice 2, the cohort was focused on the 1,072 youth served in CASCW out of home care, regardless of what type of placement they came in to CASCW care. For data to practice 3, we're really zeroing in on those 513 youth who were referred to CASCW out of home care and were not placed with family. So this is an exit cohort. And you can see comparing the exit cohort that we included in data to practice 3 compared to those youth who came in with a family placement. The youth who did not come in with a family placement were slightly older. They had were more like they spent more time while in CASCW out of home care. They had almost twice as many average number of placements prior to CASCW out of home care. And that they were less likely to exit to legal permanency. So for the remainder of the research findings, we're going to really be focusing on those 513th youth who did not come in placed with family and what we were able to do to get them to family. So this is the demographics for our sample for the data to practice 3. Again, those 513 youth. So you can see half were identified as Latino, Hispanic, a little over 20% were white, 18% Black, African American, and 6% were multiracial. And the other race ethnicity category included American Indian, Alaska Native, Chinese, and others. Had a pretty even split with regards to gender, and most who came in without a family placement were in a non-relative home placement, a group home placement, and there was very small percentage who were in a therapeutic residential facility or other placement. So in addition to examining, so really the focus is, what do we do to get youth who come into our care not placed with family? How do we get them to a family placement? And what is the impact on legal and relational permanency? But in addition, as Peter alluded to, that, emotional, behavioral, other kinds of needs can really be challenges to getting kids to permanency. We also wanted to look at the level of need. So we looked at the change between the first and last child and adolescent needs and strengths assessment. So really we're thinking about how many needs at exit were identified, how many needs were they leaving with. So we grouped the youth according to how many needs at exit they had. So we grouped them into low needs, fewer than 3 needs at exit, moderate needs, 3 to 10 needs at exit, and high needs, more than 10 needs at exit. And you can see they're pretty even groupings. And again, we want to look at how level of need really interacts with whether or not we're able to move them to a family placement while in our care, and the impact on legal and relational permanency. So now I'm going to walk through the findings. So this first slide shows the findings with regards to relational permanency, and relational permanency refers to the many types of loving, stable relationships in a youth life. And it should be noted that for the current for the current CASCW CANs, that item is focused on relationship with biological parents, and it may become clear why I'm making that note later. We'll see if anybody catches it. So what we found was that relational permanency was facilitated by being moved to a family placement while in out of home care, and also those youth who had fewer needs were also more likely to achieve relational permanency. In the lower half of this slide, we're comparing high needs youth. So comparing across whether or not they were placed with family at case closure. So while we can see 59% of the youth who were moved to family while in our care obtained relational permanency, only 36% of youth with a similar level of need at exit achieved relational permanency. With regards to legal permanency, and here we're referring to either reunification, guardianship, or adoption, that we find a slightly different findings than our relational permanency findings, in that youth who are moved to a family placement were more likely to obtain legal permanency regardless of their level of need. So again, in this lower half of this, this slide, we can see, again, we're comparing youth with a high level of need at exit, and we see compared to 15% of youth who were not placed with family at case closure, 73% of youth achieved legal permanency for those youth that we were able to get to family while they were in our care. I'm going to show this next slide. I think this is really where it becomes very powerful, the impact of moving kids to moving youth to family. Because here you can see, again, we see that 73% of high needs youth who were placed at case closure. I'm looking at the very top bar of this visual, which was presented in the earlier slide. But now I want to draw your attention to the low needs youth on the very bottom of this visual, and that represents the rate of legal permanency for youth with low needs at exit, but who were not placed with family at case closure. And you can see that the high needs youth that were placed with family had an even higher legal permanency rate than those low needs youth who were not placed with family. So this was just, when we saw these findings, I mean, we just found these very, very, very powerful, because I think, as Peter, alluded to, we kind of all had this preconceived notion that youth with a high level of need are harder to get to legal permanency. And this slide just totally contradicts that the fact that really, if we can get to youth to family, regardless of their level of need, we can get them to legal permanency. And as my colleague Matt Klaus likes to say, family, this is just very evident that family does not give up on family. So we also did a survival curve, presented in a little bit, hopefully more digestible way. Here again, you can see that this is the time to legal permanency. So on the very top, those are our high needs youth that we were able to move to family. They were the ones who got to permanency quickest. The high needs youth who were not placed with family at case closure, those were the ones that took longest to get to legal permanency. So again, these high needs youth that are placed with family, and really any of the youth that were placed with family, kind of regardless of the level of need, they were more likely to achieve legal permanency, and they were more likely to get to permanency. They got to permanency quicker. We also looked at the time to legal permanency by race to see if we were having any kind of disparate outcomes, and we did not find any significant differences. So we're really able to do this. We're able to get youth to permanency, again, regardless of level of need, regardless of race. It doesn't appear that we have really disparate outcomes when we consider race and ethnicity. And Amy, I'll turn it back over to you to speak to some of the recommendations from the field.
Thanks, Whitney. So we presented the findings that you just heard to our direct services staff, and these are the recommendations that they suggested. So we asked them, one, how are we currently moving youth to family while in our care? And they told us that one of the big things is using tools for family finding, and that's again, our relentless approach to family finding and family engagement. Busting barriers to permanency, and that goes along with the last one, teaming to support permanency. So we do a lot of multidisciplinary teaming and building relationships, across youth providers, and then also creating a relationship with the family is a huge one as well. We also asked them, what more could we do to move youth to family while in CASCW care? So this is kind of our stretch question. What would you like to see us do? So they suggested designating a family finding position so that person could be solely focused on family finding, and add more of that work to the youth's case. And then coaching from the middle. So again, that teaming approach. Doing more out-of-the-box programming. So one thing that we've been working with is outdoor programming. So getting youth into nature, and nature is healing. And then lastly, building communities of hope. All right. Next slide. Okay, great. Any questions?
And please feel free to take yourself off mute and ask any questions if you're feeling so brave, or feel free to put any questions in the chat.
Matt, we do have a couple there that folks might want to address.
So one question is, would we be willing to share some of our family finding tools? I can take that one. Yes, absolutely. You know, as an operating foundation, we share information widely and freely. And, you know, please feel free to, you can reach out to me or anyone on the panel, and we'll figure out how to get information to you. So let's see, the next question from, oh, wow, I may need a little help tracking the questions here, but the next question is from Bridget. Do these numbers hold for kids who were placed away from family at younger ages? Amy, Whitney, what are y'all's thoughts on that? Do these numbers hold for kids who were placed away from family at younger ages?
I can jump in on this one, and Whitney, feel free to add. So we did not break out the data by age range, partly because we serve generally older youth. But Whitney, if you want to add to that.
No, I think we didn't consider age range, but again, to Amy's point, because I think we do serve a pretty truncated age range that I'm not sure it would have much impact, but we certainly can look at that in the future.
And Whitney, there's a similar question around age range from Judy, and she's saying, sorry if I missed this, what was the age range, and was age a factor in any of the outcomes?
Yeah, so I'm gonna, it's been a while since I looked at the descriptive statistics, so Amy maybe can fill this in, but I think it was like 10 to 17. Again, it's an older population, so we didn't consider age. But again, it would be easy enough to consider age in our modeling, but we didn't do that for this data to practice. And Amy, does that age range sound about right?
Yeah, I would say that's the general range. And then we do have some younger youth that we serve, but primarily because those youth have older siblings in our care. So if it's a sibling group, we'll take on the younger youth as well, so that we keep everybody together. But generally it's that older range.
Amy, although this wasn't in this research, would you want to comment at all around what we have seen in terms of the relationship of age to outcomes, like in some of our other evaluative work or in our precision analytic work? I'm putting you on the spot, I realize that.
Sure. Yeah, so in our precision analytic work, we have found that our younger youth, we do have an easier time moving those youth to permanency as opposed to our 15 to 17 ranged youth. We do have lower permanency rates for them. And part of that is simply we just don't have the same amount of time to get them to permanency before they turn 18. And obviously there's a whole host of other reasons with that as well. But that's what we find for our youth.
Certainly consistent with the child welfare research base. There was another question around, has our work ever looked at differences in outcomes and timelines for youth with disabilities?
Not this far, no. So this is only the third data to practice report that's been produced at this point. Really, it's been focused on the family engagement piece of the practice model, but again, this is something certainly we can look at in our data. I also see a question about the building communities of hope.
Oh, thank you. Just that one.
That's a Casey term, and I'll let Peter jump in too. I'll do my best, but you know, Communities of Hope is a Casey Family Programs initiative, really focused on community-based, community-driven, community empowerment, wanting to build the strengths and protective factors of communities so that children don't need to be reported to CPS or come into the foster care system at all. So it's really a community-driven initiative that focuses on building up the strengths and resiliency of communities. And Peter, fill in any gaps.
Well said, Whitney. Well said. You bet. You got it.
And then I see a question about barrier busting. We're gonna get into the panel. I wonder if we want to save that question for a panel.
Yeah, I'm making a note for that right now. Thanks, Whitney.
And then I see one other question about siblings staying together and outcomes. We could potentially look at this. I don't know if we serve enough sibling pairs. Amy would maybe know better. I don't know if we serve enough sibling pairs to really look at this and generalize from our data. But again, we potentially could look at this question, and depending on whether we are able to make kind of practical conclusions, will depend on our numbers. And again, I think the last question about practice implications for reducing racial disparities, I think these are good questions to segue into the panel.
Yeah, let's do that. I know I'm excited and privileged to have the opportunity to facilitate a panel discussion that includes two of our CFS staff and one of our constituent advisors. And I know they were introduced at the beginning of this webinar, but I'm hoping that Teresa and Fanielle and Holly can introduce themselves again. And in their introductions, just say a couple words about what they do in their roles, and then we'll jump into some of the panel discussion questions. So with that, why don't we start right at the top? Teresa, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do as a parent mentor and a constituent advisor?
Good morning. Bonjour, Beniji Wang, Nibi Kwe Adijnakas. My name is Teresa Nord. My spirit name is Changing Water Woman. Can everybody hear me okay? I'll try to raise my voice a little. So like Matt was saying, I am a constituent advisor for Casey Family, as well as a parent mentor at the Equa Law Center. I work with families who have open child protection cases to help them better navigate their case plans in a way that would help them be more successful in closing out their cases. I also have lived experience, meaning I at one time had an open child protection case. I lost custody of my child, spent some time incarceration and in treatment, and I am here today with having regained custody of my daughter and trying to just mentor other families who are experiencing some of the same things that I went through. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Teresa. Danielle.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Fanielle Jones, and I'm a social worker in the Los Angeles Direct Service Office. And yeah, so I had the opportunity to train a trainer as for permanency roundtables. And so I have done some of the system improvement work in the Los Angeles area to target some of the disparities within the communities and work alongside the jurisdiction to adhere to the families that were reunifying with children. So I was able to return the children at a timely manner. So this was something that we started maybe a year ago, and I was just happy to be a part of that process. And then also be a champion for our child and family team meetings and our family group conferencing. So I'm happy to be here today and be able to share some of our busting barriers and information of how we connect our children to families and birth families.
Great, thank you, Faniel. And last but not least, Holly.
Everybody, good morning. My name is Holly Parks, and I work as the Family Engagement Liaison in the Austin field office. My primary role is to coordinate family group conferencing for our clients, and we also do a lot of teaming. So I also do a lot of facilitation of multidisciplinary team meetings, and I am really excited about this discussion and the research findings. Been working in child welfare for about 20 years, and kind of seen things go full circle. So it's great to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. And so I've noted a couple questions in the chat, and I would encourage our audience to please feel free to continue sharing your reflections and any questions you have for our panelists in the chat. But to get this conversation started, I thought we would just start with kind of a general question to all three of our panelists, and it's what were your reactions? What were your thoughts when you saw the findings through this research and our data to practice reports? And that question is for anyone, whoever would like to jump in first.
I can start, Matt. Just real briefly, I'll just say I am definitely not an expert on data when it comes to this type of stuff. But what has resonated with me is that what we already know is that families do better when they stay together. As far as the data that reflected Native specific, which is the population that I work most with, is that, Natives have been so disproportionately impacted historically by CPS, and their numbers with others, grouping their numbers together with others doesn't really reflect where they are in as far as the data goes. And unfortunately the data doesn't really reflect a specific population or the Native American population within Minnesota. So it's hard for me to speak on that otherwise. But for me, this just confirms what we already know as far as supporting relational permanency. And when that relational permanency is achieved, then legal permanency will follow. And so, that is something that I think personally for me, having had experience with the child protection system and seeing where my daughter is today, because legal permanency was taken from me at the time when I was struggling with my addictions, and she was placed in foster care and then placed with her father, who at the time was also struggling with his own addictions. The outcome has not been positive because she struggles immensely with mental health and behavioral health issues. And so it's, even though the outcome at the very end of everything is that I have now regained custody of her, the struggle hasn't ended with regards of the trauma that she has gone through, having experienced child protection. So, and I take full responsibility for everything that I have impacted on her. But I think families do much better when they're kept together, if they do have substance abuse issues, if they are placed together versus out of home placement. So I will pass with that.
Thank you, Teresa. Teresa, thank you for sharing some of your own personal story and your journey and experiences with the child welfare system. And I love what you said, that families do better together. And I also appreciated your very important reminder around not losing sight of our American Indian and Native American youth as they can get lost in our numbers because the numbers are small, but important. So thank you, Teresa. Same question to Faniel and Holly. What were your reactions? What were your thoughts when you saw the findings through this research?
So I'll speak. So when I saw the findings of the research, I immediately, what came to my mind was the high and low needs as far as, as far as like the family engagement piece. And I think that it's very important and, encouraging that within the first 30 days that, a social worker receives the case, that they are doing those birth family or, family engagement pieces. And I think that that is very important in the beginning, seeing who are their natural supports or the people that the child or the family think is important in their lives, and making those connections, and having that first child and family team meeting and saying like, well, what can we do as a social worker to have those connections strengthened? And I think that that is very important. And I can't say how influence just the birth family and foster families, and how can they work together, and then posing those questions to the families. What do they feel like they need to move forward? And I think that that's important, and keeping them connected to culture is a big piece, in their community, because ultimately once we aren't working with the families and they reunify, they still need to sustain by themselves. And I think that that is important.
Thank you, Faniel. And Holly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was really happy to learn that these findings really implicated that the work that we're doing at CASCW around legal and relational permanency is working. Kids are, as many of others have said already today, they do better with their families. We've known that for a while, and it's really exciting that we're now doing work around getting them back to family faster, getting them back to their communities, to their culture, to their connections. And, there's a number of ways that we do this. I know there have been some questions about tools that we use, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. I was not surprised by the findings. It just confirmed the importance of really relentlessly pursuing permanency for youth, and really working with the family. The family, it's not just the youth, it's also the family engagement piece, the family finding piece. If we can start doing those at the very beginning of a case rather than waiting until we don't have other options, I think that we will find youth will spend shorter lengths of stay in care.
Thanks, Holly. Well, let's follow up on that. There was a question earlier about what are some of the ways that we've been busting barriers to permanency. And Faniel, I think you touched on this just a little bit as you talked about your practice, and Holly, you alluded to some tools. So I'm going to ask that question and kind of combine it with the second question on the slide, which is how can you use these findings in your approach to busting barriers? Or for that matter, what are some of the things that you're doing to bust those barriers to permanency?
Holly, do you want to go first? Or?
And feel free to name some of those barriers too. That might help the story as well.
I can go. So I think as to busting barriers, we want to look at the family as a whole. So oftentimes we do look at maternal side of the family, and the paternal side often they get left out. And so no one even engaged the fathers in the family dynamics. And I think that that is one thing that we kind of want to look at, is the family as a whole. Who can step up and be a part of the process. Anything helps, if that's even just emotional support for family members, or some members of the family that can do the physical work. So I think that that is important to have the CFT, the Child and Family Team meetings, so that people understand what their limitations are and how they can be involved with the family dynamics. Also not to be afraid to step in and say, like, what have we done before that's worked? Because we often know that sometimes family members or mother and father may have a drug addiction, but they could have been clean for maybe 5 years, and no one ever goes back and reach back out to those family members and say, like, hey, I know it's been a while, how are you feeling now? What are some things that we can kind of help you with, if assist? And they'll say, like, hey, I've been clean for 5 years, and I want to know if I can be re-engaged with my child. And that's another avenue that we can explore. So just being creative in our family finding, being creative in our action items as far as action plans, and make it tailor what the family deems is important. I think that that is a good avenue to go, because we don't want to have cookie cutter case plans and action items, when we know that every family is different. And let's see, another thing is I can't stress building the natural supports who the family is connected to. We know that I have serviced sibling sets. So like I had as far as a sibling set of 6. So 6 was the largest. I have currently on my caseload another sibling set of 4, and we know how important it is to have them stay together. And so normally I think Holly and Whitney kind of spoke to, we kind of tailored to maybe from 10 to 17-year-olds. But if in that sibling set, if it's a 10 to 17-year-old, we get the younger babies as well. They come as a cluster, as we call it, like a sibling set cluster. And it's very amazing to see the family grow in the dynamics, and how we're able to connect them to their community, and I say their culture, because we often know that culture is very important to our families, and the more and more that they feel connected to those 2 things, which is culture and birth family engagement, the more we feel like they thrive, and they feel like they have a good sense of self and belonging.
Thanks, Danielle. Holly, what are your thoughts?
So I'll talk about just some of the barriers. As Peter mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, institutional racism is one of the really big barriers that we are always coming up against. And related to that, I think bias against birth family is something that is also a barrier. Another big one also that Peter mentioned was really access to quality substance abuse treatment. That's something, substance recovery is something, that takes a long time. It's not something that can always be accomplished in 1 year. And that's how much time the courts in Texas give youth to achieve permanency. And so we have to take in some of these clinical issues and look at them a little more deeply. And one of the ways that we do that is through teaming. I think I mentioned earlier, one of the ways we especially with the bias against birth families, we with some of our youth do monthly team meetings where we get together, we talk about those barriers, and we talk about strategies to overcome those barriers. We have found that our jurisdictional partners, as well as attorneys and CASAs, they really, it took some work, but over time they've come to see the value in teaming. And then also, family group conferencing is a model that really is about bringing the family voice back to the table. and giving them some of the decision-making power back in their own lives and their own families. And so that's another strategy that we use. We also have developed some tools around really family engagement and getting, we developed a reconnection guide where it's really kind of a clinical guide to reconnecting youth who have been separated from their families for a significant period of time, because when youth, sometimes are removed at a younger age, and then there isn't adequate family finding, or the caregivers are not in a place where they can care for the children. Their kids often stay in care for a very long time and have been completely separated from their family. And as we begin to, one of the strategies we use is, reunifying with birth family, and that's one of the things that we use to do that. Is also another meeting called the Family Connect meeting, and that's where we really just are kind of reintroducing the youth to the family, and the family to the youth, and the family to the team that helps with parental bias, where everybody can kind of explore, what's happened over the last, 5-10 years. People can change, parents and caregivers do change, they have that ability, and we often find that that's the case when we go back and revisit birth family. So those are just a couple of the tools, and also ones that we can share.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks for sharing. And Teresa, a similar question, but maybe just a little different. With your experience, with your lived experience and your expertise as a parent mentor, what barriers have you seen in achieving permanency, and what recommendations or any ideas on how we can overcome those barriers? Teresa, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So for me personally, the biggest barrier within my case was that I had a criminal charge, and so I was incarcerated for 2 years. And so, there's this specific timeline in which your case can be opened, and unfortunately, my sentence was 36 months in prison, and the social workers looked at that timeline and said, well, there's no way we can reunite you with your child in that timeline. Even though you're only going to serve 24 months, we don't want to spend the time and financial resources to keep this case open. So therefore, we're going to work to get this closed as fast as possible. And that's essentially what had happened. I was within 6 months of the case opening, I was incarcerated and signing over legal custody to my daughter's father. And I was not permitted to have any contact with her, not through the county, but he made those decisions, and it made such a huge traumatic impact on my child. And so not being able to have contact with her was a huge barrier. In so many ways, and it was quite devastating. But some of the other things that got in the way was that, there's these silos that are created where organizations and institutions aren't connecting with each other. In my case, it would be, child protection wasn't connecting with my criminal attorney or my criminal case in any way. And so, looking back on it now, I see that had there been, some communication, there could have been a more positive outcome with my case. Had my case been looked at in the sense that I am an addict, I, was charged with possessing a controlled substance. I'm not a dangerous person. I wasn't dangerous to my child. However, I did commit a crime. But I also have this disease of addiction that if I were given that opportunity for a long-term culturally specific treatment program, my need for incarceration may not have been so apparent. And therefore my child may not have been permanently removed from my care. And so that was a big barrier at that time. And I work with a lot of families that also have the same, somewhat of a same outcome to their cases, in the sense that they either have criminal convictions, mental health issues, substance abuse, you know, housing, domestic violence. Domestic violence is a huge component to a lot of the cases that I work with. And so there's all these different barriers to overcome. And, you know, like Fanny was talking about, the cookie cutter approach to a case plan. For myself, when my case opened up, there was the not only the cookie cutter case plan that was placed on my lap when I was in a very unhealthy place to even mentally be able to comprehend what was going on. But then I also had what I see as institutional racism and bias on the part of a social worker, not even recognizing that I have Native American descendancy. So that question was overlooked. I wasn't even asked. And so my case never even went to an ICWA component. It stayed as, you know, reasonable efforts versus active efforts. And so there was all these different components that I see today. If they had been looked at in a different way, my case may have been closed out in a more positive way. I hope that answers your question, Matt.
Thank you, Teresa. I want to follow up for any of our panelists. Teresa and Faniel and Holly, all of you mentioned challenges around timeframes or policy-driven challenges or systems working in silos or the reference to the cookie cutter case plans or the implicit bias inherent in people working in these systems. And Teresa, for you, you know, missing your connection to your tribe and the ICWA requirements not being brought forward into the work that was happening with you and your family. I guess my question is, so what are some of the implications of our findings? What are some of the opportunities in our practices to address these systemic barriers? And this is for anyone.
Well, real quickly, Matt, I would just say that, you know, the continuing to do this type of research can be imperative over all communities, but continuing to do cultural programming, you know, especially in the Native community, bringing together constituents to share voices, not only as advocates, but in bringing them to events such as this, but also in policy work and, you know, sharing the importance of our voices.
Teresa. Daniel, take yourself off mute. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I would say making sure that we advocate for our families. A lot of times we have to be the voices for our families. And so a lot of times, so I had a family who the children were reunified and the case was open for another 3 months with the jurisdiction. And then COVID hit. And so I asked, I spoke to attorneys, I spoke to the department social worker, and I said, hey, you know, the children are home, they're safe. You know, how can we move the court process? And so with me speaking up, I was able to have the jurisdiction social worker file a stimulus, a stipulation report. And that was to close the case under good recommendation of, you know, how well the family was doing. And with that, the family case was closed within a month, but had I not spoke up, the court hearing was for 2021. And it would have been like a whole another 6 months in care, and we didn't need that. So, you know, seeing where we can stand in places and advocate and speak up.
That's a great individual example of advocacy, Faniel. Thank you for sharing. Holly, how do you address systemic barriers? Yeah.
So Thank you, Faniel, for bringing up that. I think one way that people buy in is by hearing about success stories. And so I think it's really important to get those stories into the data. And we do that at CASE, which is a wonderful thing to do, because when we can present, you know, a successful reunification to staff in the local jurisdiction, and they see the process, they went through the process with us, we really were partners in it. They get excited about that because they oftentimes were working with youth who have been in failed adoptive homes and other placements. And so when we can really engage the family and get them on board, get them to understand what their youth's needs are, it's a lot easier to move towards permanency. And one of the things, just like we've done at CASE, we're very lucky to have the resources to be able to have some creativity when we're up against timelines and parental bias, you know, birth family bias, those sorts of things. And so that's how we were able to come up with some of the tools that I mentioned earlier. And the Reconnection Guide we've also shared actually with our adoption team in our local jurisdiction, because what we were getting a lot of referrals of youth who were either placed in adoption or were in adoptive placement, and it did not work out, and or they've been in several of those placements. And so we then get those referrals, and that's we've been going back to birth family with those, and we have found that if we use the tools and use the processes that we've developed, there is some success in these findings. And we actually went and trained the whole adoption unit or units in our area on the Reconnection Guide, and because they're adoption workers and not usually placing with family, they're placing with non-family. And as the findings of this study have shown, we know that kids do better with families. And so it was really exciting to see our jurisdictional partners also begin to start sharing that value with us. And we now see it in their work on a regular basis. We work with them very closely. They're excited to refer their cases to CASE Family, because they often, you know, they are stuck in terms of finding adoptive placements, because we do work with high-level youth, and family are much more likely to stay committed, even despite behaviors or high emotional needs. And so, yeah, I think that's one way that we is just really working closely with our partners and sharing tools to overcome barriers.
Thanks, Holly. So I'm looking at the clock and I see we're down to our last 15 minutes. And I've been seeing all sorts of comments and reflections in the chat, but I did want to pause and just see if there were any questions from our audience members for our panel. And again, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask your question out loud, or please share your question in the chat. So we'll just pause here for a second and see if there's any questions that folks want to share.
Matt, I remember some really wonderful presentations by some of the staff in the field offices. And one of the presentations really stands out was how one of the social workers was very skilled at having a conversation with grandparents, other kinship providers, about changing the arrangement from foster care, kinship care, to one that would be more permanent, either guardianship or adoption. And I just wonder if any one of the panel members might want to comment on how do you hold those conversations. And I remember sitting in families' living rooms, you know, working with foster parents in Milwaukee, but, you know, how do you, in today's age, how do you have those conversations with a grandma or an aunt or a pair of grandparents about, you know, maybe is it time to move to the next step instead of having the child sit in kinship care for year after year after year. And I remember some of the staff having some really nice insights about how to hold those conversations.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, for our panel, any thoughts on Peter's question? And if I may add a small friendly amendment to it, given the impact of COVID-19 and the fact that we're working virtually, how are you doing that work virtually?
For me, I think, so initially when we're having, so in the first 30 days, we have our family finding tool that we use. So normally I have a conversation about, you know, and when I'm creating the genogram, it's always someone in the family that holds all of the information, right? It's normally a grandmother or aunt, an older aunt that knows everyone's name. And we spark up a conversation. I'm like, okay, so tell me, you know, who would be the best person if this, it's always future questions that I like to use. So if you know, say for instance, you're unable to take care of this child, who would you want or who will you feel will be best fit to take care of this child? And if so, if we're moving and, you know, they're in placement and we know that they have family, you know, I always give them the information for you know, relational and legal guardianship. That's always, and I'm like, it's no different, and we just know that they have family, and if they were to stay with you or be with you, then you know, how would that work? And they normally just say, well, they're always here anyway, so I might as well you move forward. And it's just really having an organic conversation. Pictures always helps out too. Sometimes when I go in and I see pictures and I'm asking questions about family members or yeah, like those family finding tools, the genogram helps. Also, the safety houses, that's another tool that we use. With asking the children, like, so what works for you? Who are you connected to? If you had to live with someone, who would that person be? You know, and who are they connected to? It's always a follow-up series of questions and asking, you know, with their own comfort level, and they will tell you.
Thank you, Benya. That's great.
Peter, I think I know who you're. Sorry, I was gonna say, I think I know who you're talking about because there is, I just think I know who it is, who is particularly skilled in having these conversations with grandparents. And you know, it's just really being transparent with the family. I have found that sharing the outcomes for youth who do not achieve legal permanency with family members can be a very effective tool. I think, you know, that I remember training that in permanency values as a precursor to the roundtables, and just talking about, you know, the disparate outcomes and the pipeline from foster care to prison, and then looking at housing and, you know, how kids fare without that family legal connection. We just really talk about why that's important and are very candid in having those conversations. We're also, I just want to say a little bit about father engagement too, because I know there's been several comments about that. And, you know, one of the ways we do that is families are suspicious when a social worker calls them and starts asking questions, right? And so we have to be sensitive to that. And I think especially sometimes with fathers, they think we might be calling about child support. And so that's usually one of the first things I say is this has nothing to do with that. And that's not, you know, not anything that you and I are really even going to talk about. And not to say that that's the only barrier, there's also a tremendous amount of bias against fathers. And so we have to work on that as well. But yeah, I think the answer is to be candid, to answer their questions. What are they worried about? How can we help prepare them for what may be to come? We need to be educating families much more on trauma-informed practice. We do that a lot at Casey, and I think that it does really help. It gives families kind of a picture, an overview, a story of just exactly all that's happened. And there's intergenerational trauma too, so they know what we're talking about. It's not like it's a secret. And so I think just transparency and really trying to earn trust and stay connected is one of the keys there.
Thanks, Holly. Well, I see we're down to our last 10 minutes. There's been a couple questions that have come in the chat, so I want to ask our panelists, please feel free to respond in writing to some of the questions that were raised. And, you know, Teresa, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Peter's question. You know, what advice can you give us as a parent mentor, as an advocate, for social workers, for clinicians coming into the home and rolling up our sleeves and sitting alongside families? What advice can you give us in this work?
You know, I would say some of the most meaningful conversations that I have been, you know, blessed to be a part of are at the family group conferences, where the whole family gets together and the tribe is involved. And, you know, the family is really reassured with the amount of support that not only the tribe can provide, but, you know, for me as a parent mentor at the Equal Law Center, even when a case is closed, that doesn't mean that my support and my reference to resources, that doesn't go away. You know, I've been able to work with a couple of the other partnering agencies in Hennepin County, like Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center, Division of Indian Works. There's a few other agencies that we will continue to provide support to the kinship caregivers to kind of ease their anxiety of taking on that full-time responsibility of having permanency. You know, because that decision is never easy, but I think one of the most heartfelt things that I've been able to witness within the Native families that I work with is that it's a family problem, it's a family issue. And they really step up, whether it's grandparents, aunties, uncles, cousins, they really step up and say, okay, how can we provide the best love and care for the youth that are, you know, within the system, and also to the birth parents, whether it be mother or father or family as a whole. And so being able to have some really difficult conversations with them, but having, like I said, at the family group conferences, having a room full of different people involved that can provide the support where they're not feeling alone is probably where I've seen the best outcomes.
Thanks, Teresa. Well, Karina, I see we're down to our last 5 minutes. Do we have time to address one last question, or do you want to go ahead and start wrapping us up? What's your preference?
You can address one last question if you'd like. We have a few minutes.
Great. Well, I'm just going to go in the order they came in. And again, I'd ask Teresa and Fanielle and Holly, as you see these questions in the chat, please feel free to share your thoughts. But this question was from Bridget. And Bridget is asking how the panelists have been successful in encouraging other professional partners to consider family members that may have prior convictions, a history of chemical dependency, etc. Not all professional partners are very open to this, in my experience, especially when it seems easier and safer to leave a kid with an already licensed, often white, foster home. How have you been successful in encouraging others along?
I'll take that one. I certainly understand that struggle, Bridget. And what I'll say is that it takes time, and it takes, you know, one of the values of Casey is that we do our work relentlessly and in an urgent way. And so when we say that, we really mean it, and we are relentless, and we pursue permanency in that way. So it takes time, but with our monthly teaming, like the teaming meetings that we do, we will start small, and we're not talking about placement. We just start talking about family connection and how much that can make a difference for a youth. And so we're starting with letters and phone calls, and we gradually, as the team starts to see the youth really, you know, oftentimes getting a little bit better because they now have family that they're connected to. They start to believe in this practice of being relentless and urgent in pursuing permanency. It's not easy and it takes time, but again, once they see that actually be successful, it really has a strong impact on the entire team. And then what we find is going forward in the future, when caseworkers and CASA and attorneys have worked with Casey before, they know that that's what we're going to do. And so it's easier to work with them, but it's building that relationship with them over time, getting that trust and hearing those success stories.
Thank you, Holly.
With that, you know, as far as the question that you were saying, Matt, I have found continued encouragement for caseworkers who may be exhausted in the work and find it to be easier to overlook families who have had chemical dependency or convictions, or who cannot become legal foster care for their family. I would say for me, it's recognizing and encouraging the caseworkers to understand that it isn't always safer, it isn't always easier to leave them placed in a licensed, often white foster home versus connecting them with family, because family comes first. Family is most important. Family is who can relate to the child. And, you know, for me, that would be like saying that my criminal background and my conviction and my past addiction, here I am 5 years or almost 6 years of sobriety. That's like saying that I'm still not worthy of having my child. And forgive me, that's like saying that my brother, who has struggled with addiction in his past, and has had a criminal conviction, that's like saying that he isn't worthy of taking in my child if I were to ever relapse. So it's like saying that the family isn't as important as we all know that family is. And it's more traumatic to remove a child and put them in foster care than it is to put them with a family that had a criminal conviction in their past, if that makes any sense. And so for me, prevention, keeping families together, you know, and providing support, not just to the family, but also to the caseworkers, because they need support. They need uplifting pats on the back, letting them know that they are doing a good job, because there are some out there that do really incredible jobs with families. And so you know, there's really not an easy way to look at that.
Mhm.
I could go on and on and on, and I know we have about 1 minute left, Matt, so I'm going to be quiet. So I'll just pass with that.
Well, with that, Teresa, thank you again for sharing your experiences and your story. And thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Fanielle. Thank you to Holly. Thank you again, Teresa. I for one, really appreciated the conversation, the reflections and the insights from all of you. So I just want to thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karina so we can wrap up.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I just want to echo that and thank all of our speakers today, all of the Casey team and Teresa and Holly and Pena. Like really, really appreciate your very important and much needed perspective from the front lines, from your lived experiences. And I'm really thankful that you're able to join us and share those important words today. And thank you for everyone for tuning in. And as folks, I know before you log off, just a reminder that I will follow up with an email with CEUs, a copy of a PDF of the PowerPoint, as well as a couple links, which I'm going to also include in the chat. So if you're able to pull them out, I just sent them. We have our fall 2020 CW360 publication is officially on our website. And so I just included that link for you to be able to download. There's 20 plus articles in that publication, all related to these important conversation we're having around supporting permanency and transitions to adulthood for youth in care. And it includes a broad, an overview on current research, innovative practices that are taking place, and personal perspectives. And everything from supporting youth with disabilities, or LGBTQ plus youth, supporting kinship, lots of important topics. So I hope you're able to download that from the chat, but I also send it in email. And I also included the link to that list the rest of the series. So this was our first webinar, a part of our fall series around this important topic. And we have 5 more coming up over the next 5 weeks. And we'd love for you to join us for some of those if you can. And again, those are all free and CEUs will be provided. So thank you all once again for joining us. And yeah, we hope to see you at future webinars in the coming weeks. And we'll just let everyone kind of take your time logging off.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. I'll follow up an email with you all and send the CW360 and other stuff, but really appreciate you all, and great webinar, great conversation.
Awesome. I'm glad it worked out. And if there's anything that we can do, you know how to find us.